Welcome to Introduction to Traumatic Stress and Trauma-Informed Care. This is part 1 of a 4-module series. My name is Sabrina Matheny from the Ambit network at the University of Minnesota, which is co-sponsoring this video with the Stearns County Family Services Collaborative. The Ambit network is located at the Institute for Translational Research in Children's Mental Health at the University of Minnesota. And we are funded by the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, whose primary goal is to navigate research and practice in child trauma across our country. In Minnesota, our project co-directors are Abby Gewertz and Chris Bray. Ambit has operationalized the mission of the National Childhood Traumatic Stress Network by partnering with the Department of Human Services to train mental health professionals in trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. We have also really worked to connect front-door agencies and providers to trauma-trained clinicians by creating trauma-informed communities. In this slide, you can see the reach of the dissemination of trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy across Minnesota. And this shows you the 4 regions that we have worked with over the past 3.5 years to change trauma-informed practice across our state. So as we begin to talk about child trauma, I'd like to start with this Alice Miller quote, who says, "The truth about childhood is stored up in our bodies and lives in the depths of our souls. Our intellect can be deceived, our feelings can be numbed and manipulated, our perceptions shamed and confused, our bodies tricked with medication, but our soul never forgets. And because we are one whole soul in one body, someday our body will present its bill." You know, what we know when we interact with children who have experienced traumatic events or adults who have experienced traumatic events throughout their life is that if that bill is not paid, it gets more and more expensive as time goes on. So, to start with just some blanket statistics, that really when we look at the social cost of trauma in our country, it's approximately $220 million per day as estimated in 2012. And that the yearly cost per abused and neglected child is about $64,000 to our country. Imagine what our society could do with that money if it wasn't being focused on bad things that happen to children every day. So as we look at trauma-informed practice is really a philosophy. It's a shift away from what's wrong with you to what happened to you. It is not a step-by-step intervention to address PTSD or a manualized approach to any sort of system. Trauma-informed practice represents a shift from our more traditional paradigm, which really looked at what's the most recent event that happened to you, what is it that caused you to be interacting with me, and that we viewed behavior as willful, that people made good choices or bad choices, but they had free will to make whatever choices in their life that they wanted to, and that the solution was to connect children to the appropriate treatment resource. And as we look at a trauma-informed system, we're really moving to a place where we're looking at the totality of the impact of everyone's life experiences and understanding the neurological basis behind behavior and how our neurological experiences and patterns affect the decisions that children make in everyday situations, and to find how is it that we can really develop resilience and look at the idea that everyone who interacts with a child on a regular basis has the ability to support the development of increased resiliency. So the values that underlie trauma-informed practice are really no different than things we may seek to do every day. We want to empower the individuals we work with, develop solid, trusting relationships, ensure that people feel safe in their interactions with us, begin to build trust, and operate out of a position of giving people as much choice as we possibly can. So to start with, one of the things that we need to look at is what is trauma? That trauma is a word that we hear a lot in our society, but if we ask ourselves to define it, it becomes hard to identify and narrow in on a definition. And so if everything is trauma, nothing is trauma. And we need to really separate trauma as a different dynamic than distress. So when we look at some common traumatic events, it might be abuse, physical, emotional, sexual abuse, neglect, where children's basic needs are not met, any other type of victimization, the exposure to domestic violence in their homes or community violence in the places in which they live, accidents, traffic accidents, some serious type of medical issue, natural disasters, whether it's hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, fires, some sort of gang violence, and parental substance use. So if we pause for a minute and think about what is it that makes these situations traumatic? How do they differ from distress? So the example I'll give you is that if your 87-year-old grandmother dies in assisted living after a failing health, that may be sad, and children may grieve about that, but that's a little bit of a different experience than if a 7-year-old sibling is suddenly killed in an accident. One is distressing, one may be a traumatic event, but both may cause some sort of ongoing symptomology. But the difference when we start to look at traumatic events is that exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence that you either directly experience or witness it happen to others is it causes a neurological impact, a fight, flight, and freeze response almost, if you will. Another way we could conceptualize traumatic events is they are developmentally non-normative events that overwhelm a developmentally normative capacity to cope. So they're not things we would expect in the course of normative development, and there are things that children are not prepared necessarily to handle. So although any adolescent is going to disagree with us, if we take away their cell phones, that might be distressing, but in a developmentally normative way, they would have the appropriate skills to cope with that event. So the other thing we want to look at is the difference between traumatic events and traumatic stress, that those are really two separate dynamics. So traumatic event is what happens. Traumatic stress is the reaction that occurs after the traumatic event. So we can use the analogy of someone who has been rear-ended at a stop sign or a stoplight. And let's, for the sake of argument, call that a traumatic event. Now, the next few times that they pull up to a stop sign or stoplight, you may tense up, you may look in your rearview mirror, your heart might be faster, you might be a little concerned that you're going to get hit again. But for most people, after 3 to 4 weeks, that response goes away. And people are really able to integrate that experience with no ongoing traumatic stress symptoms. Now, maybe they think about it again if they're at that particular intersection or if the roads are bad the first time it snows, but largely it does not affect their life. And our brains are really wired to try to integrate traumatic events. And so approximately 75% of people who have experienced a traumatic event, after a period of time, will go on with no ongoing traumatic stress symptoms. But there's a subset of about 25% that do have some ongoing symptomology. And so these may be the people who don't want to drive when the weather's poor, or who will go to great lengths to avoid a particular intersection, or never want to make left turns. So somehow they have some symptoms that continue to affect their life in different ways. And when we look at children who are exposed to ongoing traumatic events, the higher likelihood is that they end up in an ongoing traumatic stress dynamic. So the other definitions we'll want to look at is the difference between acute trauma, which is like the one-time event, so a car accident, a one-time physical assault, and then we move into chronic trauma. And so these are a series of experiences that happen over time. So for example, physical abuse or exposure to domestic violence tends to be more chronic in nature. And then really, what a lot of individuals in our child welfare system end up interacting with is children and families who have experienced complex trauma. And complex trauma could really be thought of as trauma that is chronic, that usually starts when children are very young, and that is in some ways related to the adults who are supposed to be responsible for that child's care. So one of the things that traumatic stress does is it moves us out of a developmentally normative trajectory. And so when we're younger, we have more developmental tasks and developmental milestones that are closer together. So when you have traumatic events that interfere with normative development, it has a greater possibility of pulling you out of a normative life path. And then there is that unique impact of trauma when it is either at the hands of someone who is supposed to take care of you, or when someone who is supposed to take care of you has failed to protect you. And that exposure tends to have a lot longer or potentially deeper impact. So the National Child Traumatic Stress Network has identified 12 core concepts of childhood traumatic stress that they think are significantly important that people who interact with children understand. So the first of those is that traumatic experiences are inherently complex. And this can be broken down into a few different points, but one is that traumatic events are made up of many moments. And so if you think about a 10-year-old who is exposed to domestic violence, the most recent domestic violence event is made up of the moment when the tension starts to escalate, the moment when things become verbally aggressive, the moment when the first item is thrown, the moment when the first person is hit, the moment when the child decides, should they call 911 or should they hide? Should they go and attempt to help their younger siblings, or should they stay where they're at? The moment when maybe things start to die down, and then the moment when things escalate again, and perhaps then the moment when the police arrive or the ambulance arrives. And that each of those moments may have its own unique impact on the child. And what we need to do when we're working with these children is really be sensitive to ask the question, which was the worst moment for them? Because if we make assumptions based on what we think the worst moment is, we may really miss the point. And frequently, those worst moments are very subjective, and it may be that the worst moment was when they decided they didn't want to go help their younger sibling, and they stay hidden, and now they have some sense of shame or guilt about that. So really being open to asking the question and not making the assumptions. And what we can do when we communicate via paper and summarize broad traumatic events is we can miss those nuances of the moments. And for some children, perhaps the worst moment is when help arrived and the child was separated from their caregivers and they really didn't know what to expect or what was happening next. So the next point about the inherent complexity is that children may want to take actions that they cannot. And so many of us, when perhaps we're working with young children who have experienced sexual abuse, let's say we have a 7-year-old, that 7-year-old may say at some point, and then I hit him and punched him and he ran away. And we know that that may not be true, but to that child, they wanted to take that action to keep themselves safe. And so they tell us that not because it really happened or not because they're making it up, but because they really want to have that psychological protection of here's what they wanted to do and they could not. And with older children, that may also come into play in terms of a sense of shame or guilt about they failed to protect someone, or they failed to stand up to someone, or they failed to protect themselves. So also asking the question, were there things that happened that you wish you would have done differently? Can allow us to be open to where may another source of that shame lie. And Brené Brown would say that all trauma needs to become shame is silence, secrecy, and judgment. And so sometimes we're afraid to ask the questions for fear of causing additional harm. But I would really encourage us that when we don't ask the questions, what that really may do is compound a sense of silence and secrecy. And so to be the most helpful when we're interacting with traumatized children, we should be willing to ask the questions and make the unspeakable speakable. Now, they may not tell us, and that's okay, but if they're not going to tell until the 5th time someone asks, and we never get to time number 1, then they're going to carry that secret for much longer than is actually needed. There are many factors that we know which can determine the impact of trauma or loss, or which are correlated with the severity of the impact. And so a few of them are the age of the youth. So if you think about it, if you're 2 and there's no food in your house and nobody is making you food, that's a vastly different experience than if you're 12 and there's no food in your house. Because think about the resources that you can marshal if you're 12 that you wouldn't have access to when you're 2. Sometimes sexual abuse can also be one of these traumatic events that's really influenced by age. There are some 4-year-olds who are able to say, they did this to me, I don't like that, and I never want to play with them again. Because they don't have some of that social understanding of the significance of sexual abuse in the way that a child may develop as they get older. Now, that's not true of all children, but certainly true of some. So age and experience can impact how people will interpret traumatic events. The other is people's trauma history, that in some ways the effects of trauma are cumulative. And so the more traumatic events that someone has experienced, potentially the more significant that impact can be. Next, when trauma is at the hands of the people who are most supposed to take care of you, who love you and protect you, it has a different effect than trauma that's non-personal or that's more randomly viewed. The other thing I think we have to be aware of related to caretakers are the caretakers who may be the failure to protect. So if we go back to our domestic violence scenario, that the child may both have feelings towards the person who was the primary aggressor, but they may also have significant feelings towards the person who failed to protect them or failed to keep them safe. And what we know is that the responses of children's primary caregivers upon the disclosure of traumatic events is highly correlated with how well children will recover. And the last dynamic that we're going to talk about today is the possibility of secondary adversities. And I think this is one that's sometimes hard for professionals to think about. So let's go back to our domestic violence situation. We have the 10-year-old, and there was a significant domestic violence event, and one parent has been taken to jail. The other parent has been taken to the hospital in the ambulance, and that child doesn't know what's going to happen next. That when we think about what some of those secondary adversities may be, that it could be the loss of financial stability. It could be the additional stress on the primary caregiver. It could be a need to move or change schools, the shame of a caregiver who's imprisoned. But it could also be that the person who was the aggressor was the person who helped the child with their homework and was the person who maybe played catch with them. And so I think when we're talking with children who have experienced traumatic events, we need to be somewhat aware of, do they have positive thoughts or feelings or memories of the person that hurt them? Because if we don't ask that question, I think we can force kids into a false dichotomy that that person is either all good or all bad, which is not always their experience. So the next core concept is that trauma and traumatic stress occur within a broad context of children's lives that includes their personal characteristics and their experiences and their circumstance. And this is driven by both intrinsic and extrinsic factors that are unique to each individual child. So one way of thinking about trauma is less about what has happened to you and more about what you think it means. So it's the Shakespeare quote that nothing's good or bad, but thinking makes it so. And so that appraisal of traumatic events, again, is one of those things that we want to be pretty sensitive to. So to look at some of the intrinsic and extrinsic factors. So intrinsic factors, these are things like temperament, how many traumatic events they've been exposed to, what is their history of loss. And so think for a minute about temperament. There are some kids that are inherently likable. They're very engaging and everyone wants to interact with them. And there are other children who are very difficult to like. And so children who may be more likable may have an easier time accessing support resources than children who have a little bit more difficult of a temperament. Extrinsic factors may be things like their family support or their community involvement. So all of those different dynamics may contribute to how it is that children appraise traumatic events that have happened to them. And that is the end of Module 1 of Introduction to Traumatic Stress and Trauma-Informed Care.